This is what dismissive avoidants won't admit about no contact. You know that moment when you finally decide to stop chasing someone. You set boundaries. You go no contact. If they're a dismissive avoidant, they'll act like they don't even notice. They'll project this air of total indifference, as if your absence is nothing but a gentle breeze in their day. But here's what they won't admit. It does affect them. It just shows up differently than you expect. First, they might feel a strange relief, because avoidants often feel overwhelmed by emotional closeness. But relief isn't the same as not caring. In fact, your absence removes the very tension that kept them guarded. Once that pressure's gone, they start noticing the quiet. Second, no contact forces them to confront a truth they usually avoid, that connections require effort, vulnerability, and reciprocity. It's uncomfortable for them. They've spent years protecting themselves from that kind of discomfort. Third, avoidants often romanticize distance. They remember your best qualities without the daily frictions, but because you're no longer reaching out, they can't control the narrative as easily. They start to wonder if you've moved on, and that thought is unsettling. And here's the secret. Some of them do want to come back, not necessarily because they've transformed, but because they miss the emotional safety you provided. They may test the waters, send a casual "A" or bring up a random memory just to see if the door is still open. No contact isn't about punishing them. It's about creating space for you to heal, for them to feel the reality of your absence, and for both of you to see what the connection really was without constant chasing. If they grow, if they choose vulnerability, that's wonderful. If they don't, you've still won, because you've chosen your own self, respect over someone else's emotional comfort zone. When someone with a dismissive avoidant attachment style is faced with no contact, the most deceptive part of the whole situation is their reaction, or rather, the lack of any visible reaction. On the surface, they look completely unfazed. They may go about their life as though nothing has changed. They may even seem lighter, freer, as if your absence is just another ordinary part of their day. But this is where many people misread the situation. Just because a dismissive avoidant doesn't show their feelings in obvious, dramatic ways doesn't mean they aren't affected by your absence. In fact, the truth is quite the opposite. Dismissive avoidants are experts at emotional self-containment. From a young age, many of them learned that vulnerability was unsafe or unrewarded, so they built an identity around independence, self-sufficiency, and detachment. When something stirs emotion in them, particularly a sense of loss or longing, their instinct is to suppress it, not express it. This isn't because they don't feel deeply, it's because they've trained themselves to see emotional expression as a risk. So when you initiate no contact, they may feel a shift inside, but their first move is to hide it, even from themselves. Internally, a dismissive avoidant does register the change. At first, they might experience a sense of relief, not because they don't care, but because the emotional closeness that once made them feel exposed is no longer pressing against them. But relief is fleeting. As the days pass, the absence begins to settle in. Without the constant stream of communication or the comfort of knowing you're there, a subtle unease starts to creep in. They might notice that they think about you in idle moments, when they're waiting for a coffee, when they're driving home, when something reminds them of you. This awareness, however, rarely shows up in their behavior in a way you'd expect. They don't send long, heartfelt messages. They don't suddenly confess they miss you. Instead, they might casually check your social media, bring up your name in conversation with mutual friends, or mentally replay certain memories without acknowledging their emotional impact. The absence is felt, but it's kept in a locked drawer in their mind. This is how they maintain control, by containing the feeling rather than acting on it. It's important to understand that a dismissive avoidance lack of outward reaction is not the same as emotional emptiness. It's a coping mechanism. Their identity is built on the belief that they can survive, even thrive, without depending on others. Admitting that your absence affects them challenges that belief. It would mean acknowledging a need for connection, which runs counter to the protective walls they've built. That's why they often present a calm, almost indifferent front. They're not letting you see the effect you've had because in their mind, doing so would compromise their self-image. So while you may be looking for signs, a text, a call, a message through a friend, the truth is that the signs often exist only in their internal world. They feel it, but they've mastered the art of making sure no one else knows. And in many ways, that's the very thing that makes no contact so powerful. When you go no contact with a dismissive avoidant, one of the first things that happens, though they'll never say it out loud, is that the sense of pressure they felt in the relationship begins to fade. This isn't necessarily because you were overly demanding or needy, but because avoidants experience emotional closeness differently from others. For them, even healthy expressions of intimacy can feel like a kind of weight, a subtle but constant pull on their independence. When you remove yourself from their life, that pull stops. At first, this can bring them a noticeable sense of relief. They might feel like they have more space to breathe, more control over their time, and less emotional expectation to manage. But here's where it gets interesting that relief is often temporary. Avoidants tend to equate emotional space with safety, so they interpret the absence of closeness as freedom. Yet human beings, even the most independent ones, are wired for connection. After the initial relief wears off, they begin to notice something else: the quiet. The rhythm of their day has changed. The texts that used to appear aren't there anymore. The small interactions that once provided comfort or reassurance, even if they never acknowledged it, have vanished. That shift doesn't go unnoticed. Because dismissive avoidants are so attuned to protecting their autonomy, they often don't register emotional loss in the same way others do. It doesn't come in a wave of sadness or longing right away. Instead, it creeps in around the edges. They might find themselves thinking about what you're doing, wondering if you've moved on, or remembering certain moments you shared. They may even feel a strange kind of emptiness in situations where they previously felt your presence. What makes this stage so significant is that without the pressure of your pursuit, they no longer have a reason to stay guarded in the same way. When you were initiating contact, their instinct was to push back or keep you at arm's length. Now, with that stimulus gone, the dynamic shifts. There's no longer anything for them to resist, and in that stillness, they start to feel more of the absence. The mental space they were protecting is now wide open, and sometimes that openness makes them more aware of what's missing rather than less. This can be unsettling for them. They might have expected that with you gone, life would simply feel easier. But instead, they begin to see that while the pressure is gone, so is a source of emotional grounding they had quietly relied on. The very thing they thought they didn't need becomes more noticeable by its absence. And while they may never openly acknowledge this shift, it's often the point where the internal story they've been telling themselves, that they're fine on their own, starts to develop cracks. The space you've created gives them a new kind of clarity, even if they don't know what to do with it yet. When you go no contact with a dismissive avoidant, it disrupts a pattern they've relied on for a long time, avoiding the discomfort of emotional responsibility. In relationships, avoidants often keep things at a comfortable distance, maintaining enough connection to feel some benefit, but not enough to require full vulnerability. They do this, consciously or not, because closeness can feel overwhelming or unsafe. As long as you're the one initiating, maintaining, and repairing the connection, they can sidestep the discomfort of having to take real ownership for the relationship's emotional health. No contact removes that option entirely. Suddenly, the responsibility for maintaining any form of connection shifts onto them. If they want to reach out, they have to make the move. If they want to know how you're doing, they have to ask. If they feel your absence, they have to decide whether to bridge the gap or let it grow. This change forces them into unfamiliar territory because, for perhaps the first time in the relationship, the balance of effort isn't in their favor. They can't just coast on your willingness to keep the emotional door open. For a dismissive avoidant, this can stir up a deep sense of discomfort. Not because they can't reach out, but because reaching out means confronting feelings they usually suppress. Vulnerability, uncertainty, and the possibility of rejection. These are feelings they've built their entire attachment style around avoiding. It's easier for them to convince themselves that they don't need anyone than to risk the emotional exposure of admitting they do. But no contact dismantles their escape route. The absence of your presence is like a mirror reflecting back the truth that relationships aren't one-sided efforts. Some avoidants will respond to this pressure by doubling down on their independence, convincing themselves they're better off without you. But even when they tell themselves this story, the discomfort still lingers. It shows up in small ways, in moments when they catch themselves wondering about you, or when they feel a pang of something they can't quite name. These moments are cracks in their emotional armor, and they can be unsettling because they challenge the belief that they can remain untouched by emotional loss. For others, the realization hits more directly without your effort. The relationship simply doesn't exist. That's a confronting truth for someone used to relying on the other person to keep the connection alive. They may not admit it, but this forces them to reevaluate how they show up in relationships. It raises questions they've avoided for years. Questions about reciprocity, about their own avoidance patterns, and about whether they're capable of meeting someone halfway. In this way, no contact becomes more than just space. It becomes a mirror that reflects the cost of their emotional distance. It forces them to sit with the reality that connection isn't sustained by passive presence, but by active participation, something they've often managed to sidestep until now. Dismissive avoidants have a complicated relationship with distance. While many people crave closeness and see it as the natural progression of intimacy, avoidants often feel safer when there's space. In fact, they can romanticize that space. When you go no contact, the absence doesn't always trigger an immediate sense of loss in the way you might imagine. Instead, it can initially create an idealized version of the relationship in their mind, free from the friction and emotional intensity that closeness once brought. Without the day-to-day interactions, the disagreements, the requests for more connection, the moments where they felt pressured, their mind can selectively focus on the highlights. They remember the laughter, the moments you made them feel accepted, the times you shared experiences without emotional demands. In this selective recall, the relationship feels simpler and less threatening than it did in reality. This is part of why distance can feel comfortable for them. They can edit the story in a way that works for their emotional safety. But this romanticizing has an underlying tension. Because you're no longer reaching out, they lose the ability to manage the relationship on their terms. When you were in contact, they could maintain the connection just enough to feel some benefit while keeping you at arm's length. With no contact, that dynamic disappears. They can still remember you fondly, but they can't easily reassure themselves that you're still available. That uncertainty can be quietly unsettling, even if they act indifferent on the surface. As more time passes, the absence can deepen this idealization. They may start to forget the reasons they felt guarded with you in the first place. The arguments or moments of tension fade from memory, replaced by a curated highlight reel. This doesn't necessarily mean they're ready for closeness. Avoidance can stay attached to an idealized version of a person without wanting the reality of intimacy. In some cases, the distance makes them more comfortable thinking about you than actually being close to you again. At the same time, no contact challenges their sense of control. Avoidants often feel more secure when they can dictate the pace and depth of a relationship. When you're no longer initiating, they're left wondering about your thoughts and feelings. Have you moved on? Are you happier without them? Are you even thinking about them at all? These questions can stir a discomfort they rarely show because they touch on vulnerability and the possibility of loss, feelings they work hard to avoid. In this way, romanticizing the relationship from a distance is both a comfort and a defense mechanism. It allows them to hold onto a version of you that doesn't threaten their independence, while also masking the more uncomfortable reality that your absence has created a gap they can't completely ignore. And although they might not take immediate action, the combination of idealized memories and unanswered questions can slowly erode the certainty they once had about keeping their distance. No contact is often misunderstood as a tactic to make someone miss you, but its true power lies in what it does for you. When you stop chasing a dismissive avoidant, you're not simply stepping away from them, you're reclaiming the emotional energy you've been investing in a relationship that may not have been giving you enough in return. It's an act of prioritizing self-respect, of saying without words, my needs matter as much as yours, and I won't keep putting myself second just to maintain a connection. For someone who has been in a dynamic with a dismissive avoidant, this can be a profound shift. Often, the relationship has revolved around you doing most of the emotional work, initiating conversations, planning time together, resolving conflicts, and making sure the bond stays intact. This effort can become so habitual that you don't even realize how much of yourself you're giving away. By going no contact, you interrupt that pattern. You stop feeding a cycle where your self-worth is tied to whether or not they choose to engage. What happens next is just as important. No contact forces you to sit with your own emotions rather than focusing on theirs. It creates space to feel the disappointment, the hurt, and the longing without trying to fix those feelings by reaching out. That process can be uncomfortable, but it's also where growth happens. You begin to rebuild a sense of identity that isn't dependent on their validation. You learn, sometimes for the first time in a long time, that you can survive and even thrive without their presence. For the avoidant, your decision sends a different message. Without you continually closing the gap, they're left with the natural consequences of their emotional distance. If they want to re-establish contact, they have to do the work. If they choose not to, you've already set a boundary that protects you from falling back into an unbalanced dynamic. Either way, you've removed yourself from the exhausting role of the emotional caretaker. The most empowering part of this is that your sense of worth starts to shift from external to internal. You're no longer waiting for them to show up in a way that makes you feel valued. Instead, you're showing yourself that you are willing to walk away from situations where your needs aren't met. This change doesn't just affect your relationship with the avoidant, it influences how you approach all relationships moving forward. By choosing self-respect over re-engaging in old patterns, you're setting a new standard for how you want to be treated. You're saying that connection is important, but not at the expense of your peace, dignity, or emotional well-being. Whether the avoidant comes back ready to meet you halfway or remains distant, you've already taken the most important step, choosing yourself over the comfort of a familiar but unfulfilling bond. So if there's one thing to remember, it's this: no contact isn't about playing games or trying to get someone to change. It's about breaking the cycle that's been draining you, giving yourself the space to heal, and allowing the truth of the connection to reveal itself. A dismissive avoidant may never openly admit the impact your absence has, but that's not what matters most. What matters is that you've chosen to step into your own worth, to stop chasing, and to let your silence speak louder than words ever could. You can't control whether they grow, face their fears, or step into real vulnerability. But you can control how you show up for yourself, and by protecting your peace, you're already winning. Thank you so much for being here and for giving me your time today. I hope this message not only gave you clarity, but also the reminder that your value doesn't depend on someone else's ability to recognize it. Stay strong, keep your standards high, and remember, the right person will never make you beg for the connection you deserve. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you next time.